My name is Dan Farisi. I'm the editor of Sound and Communications. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar about how the commercial AV industry can benefit from the recently passed American Rescue Plan Act. The chat function should be enabled, as should the Q&A function. So during the course of this webinar, which will last about an hour or so, feel free to interact in the chat. If you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A tab if possible. And then toward the end, I'll leave some time to go through as many of those questions as possible. So you can direct them to me or to the panelists broadly, and then I will navigate through those questions at the end of the webinar. So again, this is a webinar about how the commercial AV industry will benefit from the American Rescue Plan Act, which was recently signed into law. I'm joined by three excellent panelists who know a lot about this topic. Should be a very informative hour for all of us watching today. First is Peter Hansen. He is economic analyst with Avixa. Thanks so much for joining us, Peter.
Thanks, Dan. Great to be here.
We're also joined by Troy Jensen, who is senior manager, enterprise accounts with Shure. Welcome, Troy.
Thank you, Dan.
And we also have Meredith Boylan with us, who is a partner at Venable LLC. Welcome, Meredith.
Thank you.
So this is obviously a very big topic, and most people, I think, are at least passingly familiar with the American Rescue Plan Act, if only because a lot of people have seen $1,400 direct deposited in the last couple of weeks. But obviously, with a nearly $2 trillion piece of legislation, there's a whole lot of elements, multifarious elements of different categories directed to different groups of people, different industries in need. So just to set the table and provide some context for the people watching this webinar, can you give our viewers a sense of how big of a scale the American Rescue Plan Act is compared to legislation that might be stimulative in the past, and all the different elements that are in it, beyond the things that redound to people's personal benefit, like those $1,400 survival checks?
Yeah, this is a huge stimulus package. When you look backwards to crises before the pandemic, the stimulus package, which was really huge at the time, very hotly debated for the Great Recession, was about 800 billion, which is closer to 1 billion in today's dollars. So we're just about double that with this stimulus bill, which is even more remarkable when you consider that it's coming on the back of last year, April, a $2.2 trillion CARES Act. And then another hundreds of billions of dollars in the December stimulus package. And now here we are dropping another $1.9 trillion stimulus bill. And that is of the magnitude to have a really, really big and positive effect on the sort of economic output this year.
Absolutely. When you invest $2 trillion into the economy, it can't help but have a very significant impact. As I say, there are obviously benefits that redound to individuals, but there's also state and local government funding. There's funding targeted to specific industries. Can you, anyone in the panel, give us a sense of just how broad the package is in terms of where the money is going, other than to individual taxpayers' accounts?
Well, as Peter alluded to earlier, it's kind of hard to look at the ARPA and not ignore the other two that were previously passed, right? And the two segments, from my perspective, that are really of interest to audiovisual are going to be education, probably primarily, right? And then smaller businesses, right? And some of that even includes performance spaces, which have suffered dramatically. I mean, there has been literally, yes, the restaurant industry has been hurt, but the performance industry has been obliterated for the most part. It's non-existent. So between the three bills that have been passed, the three acts that have been passed, there is a lot of stimulus for those types of facilities, for AV integrators, consultants, manufacturers, to have interest in.
And one thing that I think folks should understand is that we've seen an evolution in these stimulus packages over time. So, and especially it's important when you're thinking about the breadth and what this stimulus does. The CARES Act, $2.2 trillion, was pretty business centric. It did send out $1,200 checks and it expanded unemployment benefits, but the majority of those dollars is really going to businesses to try and keep them afloat, maintain their payrolls, help them avoid layoffs. Now, the majority of the dollars in this bill are really trying to put dollars in the pockets of really everyday Americans. And that's those $14 stimulus checks like we talked about, but it's also further extension and expansion of unemployment benefits. That's $300 on top of your whatever unemployment checks you're already getting, extended through September. And there are big dollars going to families for their child tax credits, and that's also become a bit of a technical detail, but it is quite impactful. It's become fully refundable, which means that you can get those child tax benefits even if you're not a big taxpayer, because with a big tax reduction, if you're not paying taxes or not a lot of tax, not thousands and thousands of dollars of taxes, you might not be able to access that. But that's one of those things that this new bill does. So it's very person-centric as opposed to business-centric. Now, that said, as Troy mentioned, and as we'll get into later, there are key business provisions in there, including some dollars for event venue operators. Also, there are key dollars for education and really important dollars for governments, state and local as well.
Yeah, and in my world, where we've been following the latest legislation is the additional modifications to the Paycheck Protection Program, modifications to the shuttered venue operator grants, which is also commonly known as Save Our Stages, the Save Our Stages initiative. And most recently, this new round of legislation introduced some provisions that are specifically targeted to restaurant operators. And so, while the shuttered venues and the PPP is it's an iterative process. The law for PPP came out with the CARES Act back in last April of 2020, and has since seen modifications and enhancements through subsequent rounds of legislation. The shuttered venues program is a more recent development that was introduced in December, although the program has yet to kick off, but they're still kind of fine tuning, I think, some of the rules around it. And then, of course, the restaurant relief is brand new and is also, I think, going to be very helpful to an industry that is really in serious need of some support, targeted support.
Since everyone seems to agree, there are a lot of different verticals that we can touch on, but everyone seems to agree that education is going to be a primary beneficiary of ARPA and the general stimulus efforts being put forth by the administration. Let's talk about education. How are these dollars going to be funding, or going to be flowing to, rather, the education segment? Is it going to be going as direct grants to education institutions? Is it going to be to upgrade them for digital learning and hybrid learning? How is the money going to get to these education institutions? And then therefore, how can people in the commercial AV industry, whether they're the manufacturers or the integrators, consultants, benefit from those funds and put themselves in a position to benefit from that funding?
Well, part of it is the part of the ARPA and the previous relief bills applies to the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund. And about 50, in all cases of all three relief bills, 50% of that is going to scholarships. So that goes directly to students. The remaining is for improvements. Now, most of those improvements are going to be getting students back in the classroom, air quality, things like that. The other part of it is going to apply to helping continue remote learning. Through this whole pandemic, people, teachers, educators have had to pivot and learn a new skill. And I think that practice is not going to go away as we move out and away from the pandemic. Certainly, the ability to teach remotely is going to help immensely for things like, will we continue to have snow days? Certainly, I know the kids don't want to hear that, but, in many instances, school years have been extended due to snow days. Well, now we have a new thing that we can use to eliminate that, right? The other group of people, it can help students with disabilities, right? Or those who come down with an illness and still maintain, a daily connection to the classroom. So things like that are going to continue. And frankly, schools, even through the previous two relief bills, have not activated as many classrooms as they need to. And we're going to see a continuation of active classrooms, or the activation of classrooms, if you will. And some of this money can be used for those purposes, not all of it. So there's definitely rules and regulations throughout these relief bills, and what you can do with the money. And certainly Peter and Meredith can speak to that specifically better than I can.
Yeah. Troy mentioned a lot of those higher education dollars. The most recent bill, ARPA, has something like $40 billion for higher education, which, as Troy mentioned, mostly has to go to direct relief to help for students. But there's actually over $120 billion going to K-12 education. And those dollars are, they're supposed to be for getting students into classrooms, helping schools manage the crisis. And that's not just to say, all the things that you can think of, like increased custodial staff, plexiglass, HVAC filters, HEPA filtration, but that's also for things like reduced class capacity, so adding more classrooms. So that's AV dollars right there for outfitting more classrooms. So some of that will be going to AV quite directly. The other part too is that as these schools have $120 million earmarked for robustness and safety against the pandemic, that means that these scarce dollars that they're dealing with, like that they've been trying to direct towards having safe schools, that's released for other things, right? So it is able to be used elsewhere. And another key provision for schools that people should not ignore at all is that the new stimulus includes $350 billion for state and local governments. Now, in the Great Recession, the federal government didn't really step up and give state and local governments really any support at all, which had major negative consequences, negative economic consequences, because state and local governments don't have the capacity to run budgets. So when they have a crisis like this, the tax base shrinks, and they are just simply forced to make very painful cuts to things like police, basic services, and schools. And that is really bad for the economy, and it's really bad for investments in things like technologically competent and advanced and effective classrooms. So the federal government willing to take on a little bit more debt to help states and local governments maintain their education funding among the rest of their government spending and funding is going to be really good for AV in the education vertical. It's really going to help education avoid like painful belt tightening that was hard on the economy, and probably hard on especially like outside contractors who are trying to serve the K-12 and public higher education industry.
So one way to think about it, Peter, is there are two different ways in which education institutions can be funded through this. I mean, two streams essentially, one of which is through state and local, as you say, and one of which are specifically earmarked education funds that are separate and apart from the state and local.
Yeah, exactly. Direct dollars that have to go to schools, plus just this avoidance of a budget pinch that would really, frankly, otherwise be unavoidable if the federal government wasn't willing to prop up state and local budgets for the next year or two.
So suppose that I'm an integrator and I have a long history of doing outstanding work in the education vertical, be it K through 12 or be it higher education. My assumption is not every education institution is going to benefit from this. Not everyone is going to qualify. And as you say, some is going to have to go to ventilation. Some is going to have to go to more prosaic things in AV technology. Is there a way for me as an integrator to know who the beneficiaries are or who to go to? I mean, I have the skill set to do this work, but I need to know who's going to be in a position to hire me. Is there a way for me to know that?
Well, a lot of it's going to rely on your relationship with those educational institutions that you're already doing business with, hopefully. I mean, if you're starting, if you're just starting now, somebody's probably already in line ahead of you with that particular customer. So I would first focus on existing relationships with educational facilities that you do have a relationship with. I don't believe there is a way to track who's receiving funds unless Peter might know better than I on that subject.
Yeah, I don't know. I might defer to our legal expert here, Meredith. Is that something that the bill helps us track?
I don't know about on the education side. I know, with respect to the Paycheck Protection Program, they've been tried to be as transparent as possible about the recipients of those funds. And I would expect that there may be similar disclosure around some of the other programs. But I don't know if that's going to be, a spreadsheet that you can pull down off the internet or if it's a more cumbersome process like filing a FOIA request. So that's not going to be very, certainly FOIA request is not going to be a very quick way to try to make your connection. So I suspect it is going to be word of mouth and just making some phone calls and trying to sync up with your.
One thing I would suggest is to stay current with the local news and your key environments, because a lot of these things are going to be, these decisions are going to be made pretty real time, right? That it's going to be like the school board making interpretations about exactly, or making decisions rather about how they want to invest these dollars, right? So just because they get some money, it doesn't mean that there's a big chance for it to go to AV or a small chance for it to go to AV. That's going to come down a lot to the school board. I mean, if their focus is on like purely on cleanliness and filtration, like, okay, maybe they're not going to have that many AV dollars. But if they're talking about, say, for example, extending the school year, hybrid learning, if they're talking about reduced class sizes, that's where you're going to start to see more AV dollars come out of those stimulus. So I would say to some extent that you really want to follow that local news, especially because even if you're able to track those education dollars, exactly how the government dollars, the local government, the state government that are funding education, how those are distributed are going to be similarly important, right? So if you're tracking one but you're not tracking the other, you could miss out on some opportunities. So I would try to encourage folks to stay plugged in to the really frankly the local news in your key markets, to say like, in my county here in Northern Virginia, like Arlington announced that hybrid through the rest of the year, trying to do 5 days a week in school in the fall. And I'd work from there, and follow the dollars from, or think about what AV can do to help them achieve that goal now that they've set it.
Now, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I think there are elements of the CARES Act where funds haven't yet been spent or haven't yet actually flowed out. So I assume that the opportunities that ARPA presents are going to be present for months and probably years to come, because it's going to take time for 1.9 or $2 trillion to actually flow out, be allocated, and be spent. Is this really a long-term opportunity for commercial AV integrators in the education space where we could start seeing this money flow for a period of months or even years?
I think years might be not necessarily the best way to think about it. Now, that said, to the extent that some of these long-term transitions that Troy has mentioned, long-term hybrid, long-term inclusion of remote learning, potentially, right? But I do think that the way these dollars are being spent is going to be their effect is primarily going to be felt in the kind of 2021, not just spring, right? Like, but also as schools transition back mostly to, or almost, probably, pretty uniformly to full-time in person in the fall. It's going to be that full, not spring dollars, summer dollars, and even fall dollars as they kind of adjust in real time to the challenges they're seeing as they, work under different circumstances and with a little bit of extra financial backing for that.
Talking now about live events, which is the other kind of major category that we all agree that ARPA is going to have a significant effect on. Just to kind of give us a backdrop or some context, would you say that the live events collectively, the panel, would you say that live events are continuing to struggle just as badly as they were last spring, this past summer? Are we seeing some signs of life from the category, or is it still desperately in need of support? And then we'll get into the means by which ARPA will support them.
Definitely desperately in need of support. I mean, we're still not at a stage yet. We're still in the midst of the pandemic, right? We haven't climbed completely out of it yet to a point where we can gather in large groups. As Meredith mentioned earlier, the Save Our Stages Act, that was really part of the December relief bill, which ARPA has added money to. I mean, in December, they gave, I think it was 15 billion, Peter, keep me honest, 15 billion in December. And then ARPA added another 1.5 billion to that effort. But again, these are smaller venue facilities, right? And probably the ones that have been hurt the worst, right? They're reliant on an audience. Through this, a lot of people, artists and some of the bigger promoters have figured out how to do a subscription-based performance, or in some cases even drive-ins. But all of that pales in comparison to the dollars that were earned in these types of events previously. And certainly, look at theater. That's a certain area. Broadway is dead, as are all the touring companies that would go across the country. Conventions. Peter's group has felt that as hard as anyone, right? We just don't have the capability to gather in large groups yet. And until we get to that, significant, quote unquote, herd immunity, I don't see that happening. And that most likely is not going to start to break until, I would say, earliest late summer, right? They're talking about people being able to start to gather in July, but in the numbers that we'd like to see for live performance or events, I don't see that really changing until closer to the end of the summer, maybe fall. And certainly the Save Our Stages was a big step. The National Independent Venues Association was a big promoter of that particular act. And again, that's grant money that was part of the previous relief act from December and is now continued through the ARPA. Again, there's so many aspects to these relief bills. If you have interest, whether it's in education or Save Our Stages, go to the Googler, right? And start looking up some of these things that are specific to your core business. If your core business as an AV integrator is conference rooms, well, then maybe you want to be a little bit more interested and keyed into education, distance learning, and the corporate environment, the enterprise corporate environment. If your pension or business was on a performance model, certainly start looking at Save Our Stages and things like that, when we might be able to start opening the valve a little bit on some of these live events.
Yeah, I think with particularly with the live event spaces, there's a tail, right? So some of the, let's say New York City, some of the size restrictions, capacity restrictions are being relaxed a little bit. But for, I think, a lot of these venue operators, okay, now we can bring some people into our space, but are artists going to want to book a half full theater? So there's, even though there are restrictions that might be easing, the economic reality of getting back to normal with performances that are worth it from the artist's perspective and also the venue's perspective, I think it's going I do agree. I think it's going to take some time. It's not just a light switch isn't going to go on overnight and all of a sudden, we're going to concerts all the time. It's just that there's going to be a ramp up period. And so hopefully some of the relief in these packages will help to mitigate, the ongoing financial strain, even during this slow return to normal.
Yeah, I would add three things to the points that Meredith and Troy have made. One is that Avixa has our Global AV Insights community, this panel that we survey every month, and many live events members, community members are part of that panel. And they give us their comments and tell us how things are going. And I read all of them. And February was actually the first time that I got like a meaningful kind of pitter patter, but like number of comments that were positive about live events. They were positive saying live events are happening, but they were positive in the sense that like folks saying like, hey, we actually have some live events like being scheduled right now. The summer dates are like, they're in pencil, but they're on the calendar. And so I think that, and you can see like, okay, spring training is happening in Arizona and Florida, and it has some in-person attendees, and baseball's talking about having in-person attendees like for all like major league games pretty much. So you can see that little bit of stream already kind of getting starting for outdoor events, right? But there is a fair bit more positivity about that switch happening. Maybe I'm a little bit more optimistic, thinking, yeah, like I'm believing in June, July, than Troy's thinking late summer. Hopefully, I'm midsummer for me, maybe. But there is a lot of positivity around the corner. I'd want to echo and emphasize the point that Meredith made about it being a process to get back to in person, because it's not just law. Something that one of the big points that I make. It's not just what the official regulations say, because people are forming their behavior upon what they think is best, what they think is safe, right? And that's informed by what the government allows and says is okay, but it's not dictated by that. So it'll be a process to ramp back up. And the third thing is it's going to be a process for those businesses as well. And the Save Our Stages grant money hopefully will help them to ramp back up. I mean, they will have laid off staff. They might not have, all their equipment might not be 100% ordered because it hasn't been used, right? They're going to have a lot of challenges just getting back to normal operations. So that's going to be a ramp up. I'm optimistic for the second half of 2021 for live events, but there are some challenges ahead, certainly, and it's great that there is the financial support mostly to into smaller independent venue operators, because they really need it.
Yeah, well, to Peter's third point there, I mean, previously occupancy was typically dictated by the fire marshal. And here through the pandemic, the CDC has been the main entity to determine what occupancy should be. So, the question is, how much is the CDC going to be involved in occupancy numbers moving forward? And to my mind, that's a big question. We were quick to unlearn all of the lessons from the Spanish flu 100 years ago, right? Well, what are we going to retain from this pandemic in terms of things like occupancy and healthy buildings?
Speaking of occupancy and kind of taking it in a slightly different direction, everyone's mentioned Save Our Stages, which obviously is very, very important as a mechanism of helping live performance venues. Are there particular occupancy levels or categories of stages that qualify versus that don't? Like, could a Broadway theater qualify? Does it have to be a local community playhouse? What is the size or the scope of Save Our Stages, and who can benefit from it versus who cannot benefit from it?
So broadly speaking, and all of these categories have some nuances to the definitions, but it's live venue spaces, theatrical spaces, theatrical producers. There are museum provisions that are specific to museums, movie theaters. There's some provisions that are industry specific to talent managers and talent representatives. the limitations are not quite as there is a 500 employee factor, but it is not necessarily a determinative factor. It kind of balances your international and multi-state presence along with your employee size. So it's a little more of a nuanced eligibility threshold in that respect. Mm-hmm. I was looking at if you go to SBA.gov, they have a landing page and there's tabs to go to the PPP program and there's tabs to go to the, we're calling Save Our Stages, is called Shuttered Venue Operators Grant under the statute and on the PPP website. So if you're looking for that information, look for it's not a very elegant acronym, but SFOG would be your acronym. And there is some discussion in the frequently asked questions document that is posted on that website and which is updated much like the PPP program. It's a constant shifting sands. They're updated, sometimes a couple of times a week. So there is some discussion in there about, who qualifies from a definitional perspective, like is a service provider to a live venue operator eligible for a shuttered venue grant. And, the FAQ question, and I'll read it so I don't misstate it. It asks, are service and support companies that provide stages, lighting, sound, casts, and other support for live performing arts events eligible to apply for a shuttered venue operator grant? Unfortunately, the answer they have there is no. But the silver lining that I see with the shuttered venue program, which separates it from the PPP program, is it allows the recipients of shuttered venue funds to spend those funds on independent contractors. Under the PPP program, it's really designed for your own employees. And so the eligibility and use of fund provisions in the PPP is a little more restrictive on that ground. So much like I think your educational discussion that we had earlier, I think there's room for contractors or vendors who provide support services to these venues to potentially get paid as these industries are ramping back up if they have received shuttered venue operator grant dollars. There should be some room for them to be able to spend some of that funding on costs associated with the enhancing the space itself and getting ready to put on these presentations. But this is discussed a little bit more on that FAQ document if anyone is interested in reading it.
Yeah, and one thing Avixa just released our first quarter macroeconomic trends analysis meta report for 2021. And what we looked at in there was essentially how hard different vertical markets were hit in 2020 with the GDP style data through the first 3 quarters of 2020 to kind of interpret the position of businesses in those vertical markets going forward and what that would mean for people looking to provide AV equipment with them, looking to partner with them as clients. And one of the things that becomes clear when you look at the harder hit spaces like live events is that they're dealing with very, especially in independent places, limited financial reserves, which creates a big restriction on their ability to make investments. And that's something that, these Save Our Stage money is kind of coming late in the game. Like we're potentially only a couple months before they're hopefully getting back into pretty normal operations. But what that money really helps to do is relieve some of the financial pinch that they're in, give them a little bit of breathing room and allow them to ramp up a little sooner, ramp up a little bit more aggressively, ramp up with, frankly, better AV. They won't have to really penny pinch thanks to having a bit more dollars from this government support.
Are there particular do's or don'ts that any of you would share with whether they're integrators looking to get PPP for their own company, whether they're university personnel on this webinar looking to get funds for their education institution? If you're actually looking to benefit from this, are there particular do's or don'ts about how you should apply, the rigor with which you should do the paperwork? Is there anything that you can share?
I mean, from a PPP perspective, and just to very quickly recap, these are loans that individual businesses can pursue if you use the funds according to the rules for the purposes that the rules allow. And you're supposed to spend a certain amount of the funding on payroll in order to qualify for 100% forgiveness. But the upshot is, if you follow all the rules and get it all right, you could theoretically get your loan forgiven. So it is a loan, it's not a grant, but it is a potentially forgivable loan. That program has been in the news a lot. I'm sure your listeners are all familiar with it and have heard about it. Right now, there is another round of funding, another opportunity to get a first draw PPP loan if you haven't participated in the program before, or to seek it's called a second draw loan, which you have to have had a first draw loan and exhausted it or be close to exhausting it in order to qualify for a second draw loan. That's a long way of saying that the program right now is designed to close on March 31st. There's been activity in Congress to get that extended into May. I'm hopeful that will happen, but unfortunately, it's just kind of seems to have stalled a bit. Maybe we'll get some news today. But in anticipation of a March 31st date, some lenders are starting to, shut down their portals in order to give themselves some bandwidth to get all of their ducks in a row. So if you are interested in a PPP loan, you should definitely be reaching out to your lender and to see what their application process is right now. Most lenders use a portal. The PPP application itself is sort of deceptively simple. However, you're going to want to make sure you have all your payroll documentation and all sorts of additional information that can support your application down the line. And again, if you go to the SBA website and you go to the PPP tabs, there's a landing page, and you can look at the different kind of overviews of the traditional first draw program and also the second draw program as well.
Two quick additional points, and Meredith, correct me if I misstate anything here, because I know you're the prime expert here. But one thing we were discussing before the webinar even started on a little call here is that the ARPA includes a fix to guarantee eligibility for Save Our Stages folks who are also applying for PPP dollars. Now, originally that wasn't necessarily needed because we thought that the Save Our Stages grant money would be open for applications early in the year, and so operators wouldn't have to choose between PPP and SVOG, or would be able to choose between the two with full knowledge. Now, what happened was took the Small Business Administration quite a while to get the Save Our Stages program off the ground. In fact, applications aren't opening until April 8th. I see Meredith nodding, so I've got the date exactly right there. And what ARPA did is said, you can apply for PPP dollars without giving up your eligibility to SVOG. That was not allowed before. Now, I'll let Meredith explain exactly what it means if you apply for PPP and also go for SVOG, because I'd be parroting what her expertise anyways if I said it.
So right now, if you were to apply for, if you had applied for a PPP loan prior to December 27th, I think that's kind of a different discussion. That's not really relevant to this. Where this came into play was for borrowers who wanted to participate in the PPP program after December 27, 2020, which was when the Economic Aid Act was passed, and also apply for a shuttered venue grant. The way that the lay of the land is right now is that if you apply for a PPP loan after December 27th, 2020, but before you applied for a shuttered venue grant, you will not be disqualified from applying for a shuttered venue grant. However, the amount of your PPP loan will be deducted from your grant amount. So if you were initially eligible for a $5 million grant and you got a $1 million PPP loan, your grant amount would be reduced to $4 million. So that's the fix. It's not, I mean, it's still, you're going to still end up theoretically with the same net amount. And, but unfortunately the fix, I think, is really due to just the you know, as Peter was saying, the long runway and getting this shuttered venue program up and running has been sort of, it's been very frustrating to the venues and other businesses that really want that funding, need that funding.
So let's just talk a bit about macroeconomics, because obviously the commercial AV industry is in some ways on the sea of the broader economy, and we rise or fall with the sea of the economy. I was reading recently that Goldman Sachs is thinking we may get a 8% GDP by Q4. I know that's probably a little bit higher in the range than the consensus forecast, but are you feeling like with the injection of, I think collectively $6 trillion with all the various stimulus plans, are we going to be looking at like a boiling hot economy really growing and pumping by the end of the year? What are your thoughts?
Good question. And the way you asked it, boiling hot, like there's, it's almost like a little bit of a minefield to answer. Boiling hot, people tend to think, oh, inflation, right? So a lot to discuss there. First of all, yeah, the stimulus investment is a huge deal. The 8% figure from Goldman Sachs may be a little high. I think the Federal Reserve is talking about 6.5%. Wells Fargo, I just saw, was talking about 6.4%. I think that mid-6 range, probably maybe a little bit better consensus guess, especially I trust the Federal Reserve, because that's really their job to measure the economy, as opposed to, you know, securities evaluation, which is more the job of Goldman Sachs. And what's quite remarkable about this, actually, basing this on some Congressional Budget Office projections, but with the additional $2 trillion or $1.9 trillion injection from ARPA, that they project, you know, the experts at CBO project that we'll get back to essentially the kind of counterfactual GDP level, where we would be, kind of the course we would be on if we never had the pandemic, which is pretty crazy. I mean, if you go back and you look at the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, and look at the GDP course, like we didn't really go too big. You know, the stimulus that we did after that crisis is nothing compared to what we've done after this crisis. And we never got back to that GDP. It took created a very long recovery to even get back, like just in real dollars, to like the level that we're at pre recession. Took 2011, and that was, you know, before you even adjust for inflation. And in this case, we're talking about like getting back there in 2022, and not just back there, but getting back to well beyond, you know, several percent beyond what we were in 2019. So that's remarkable, and that's really good. I mean, I think, you know, we've been talking about education, we've been talking about a lot of events, and that's, you know, such an important conversation. But we shouldn't lose the forest for the trees in the sense that, like, just the overall impact, like I said at the outset, this is about putting dollars into the pockets of everyday Americans, and that's going to juice GDP a lot. And that's just awesome for AV, you know. I'm preaching to the choir here, but you know, we're such a diverse, multifaceted, capable industry that we reflect the wider economy, because we're involved in so much. We're supporting so many different industries, different vertical markets, different types of people and types of business. So seeing the projections that will have such a strong bounce back in 2021 is really heartening, you know, personally and for our industry in general.
Speaking of projections, Peter, I just wanted to ask you a quick follow-up. Did you want to say something, Troy, before I?
Yeah, you know, we talk a lot about the dollars, but until we feel free to move about the country and the world, right? I don't know that it's just the dollars that are going to make the difference, right? It's great to be sitting on a pile of cash, but that cash needs to start exchanging hands. And until the economy is back to a state where people are comfortable getting on trains, people are comfortable getting on planes, listen, the latter half of 2021, absolutely, but how latter, you know? So we'll see. Not to be a Debbie Downer, but it's going to take a little while, I think, before people are comfortable moving back in their routines that they had previous to the pandemic.
Yeah, yeah. The a point that Chair of the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell, has made several times, and as very recently as well, is that the biggest thing that anybody can do for the economy is like get everyone vaccinated, because as Troy says, like, yeah, we can keep throwing money. We threw $2.2 trillion last year, and we still had we're still down 4% GDP, or a little bit over 3% GDP wise in 2020, and that's because we could not have a normal activity because it was dangerous for our health, for public health, right? So we need to have, if we're going to achieve that 6.5% growth that we're kind of on track for right now and we're really hoping for, we need to see through the rest of spring and or early summer. We need to see this countrywide vaccination program through. We need to see it be successful. That's a really good point there.
Absolutely. So a quick follow-up with you, Peter. Obviously, you referred to some forecasts by Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, et cetera. Obviously, Avixa also does its own industry-specific economic forecasting. If I remember correctly, the forecast from a few months ago basically called for a return to growth in 2021, but we wouldn't see new heights of growth, new peaks of growth until 2022. I believe that your team is still in the midst of kind of doing your next round of assessments, but I don't know if you can give us any kind of a preview. Are you thinking at this point that we may, with all this stimulus, actually achieve true growth in 2021? Or does it still look like 2022 is when we're going to hit a new height relative to before the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a good question. And part of it is going to really depend on where you're talking about, right? So globally, we're talking about 2022, and I still feel pretty good about 2022 globally. Now, the reason for that is that the stimulus is really good for the United States. It gives 2021 a chance to exceed 2019. I mean, that CBO projection about GDP versus counterfactual is showing like the second half of 2021 being kind of even above the counterfactual and well above what we were at in terms of like daily economic activity in the second half of 2021 over 2019. And that's something that we actually have been talking about throughout the last year, is that on net 2021 was going to be lower, but that's because the beginning of 2021 would be much lower, and then maybe the second half, the late part of 2021 would be above, and that's sort of net out to just below. So feeling good about the second half of 2021. That's something we felt for a long time. So this is reasonably in line, maybe a little bit more bullish, but again reasonably in line for the U.S. APAC has fared better, I think, than we expected, and our December update to our market sizing IOTA report reflected that like China saw growth for their total AV spending in 2020, which is pretty remarkable considering where they were in January last year and where so much of the rest of the world is. But there is something of an anchor, kind of a negative, coming in below expectations, and that's Europe right now. Unfortunately, despite their wealth and some of their investments, they've had a very poor vaccine rollout. Places like Hungary seeing as high of cases and deaths as ever. France just entering another month-long lockdown. Things are tough there. And it is going to be a challenge for us, an effort to try and measure that and accurately net that out for what it means for the global economy. So I feel good about the United States 2022 still. Maybe it's possible 2021. That would be a fortunate. Certainly by the second half of 2021, we'll be at activity levels that certainly should throw that out as a forecaster, but likely in late 2021, we'll be at AV spending levels that are beyond what we were at in 2019. And for a full year, I feel really good about 2022. Yeah, and since I brought up this dichotomy between Europe and the United States, even just broadly economically, even before you even talk about AV, it is possible that like in the summer, late summer, in the fall, that the biggest drag on the economy in the United States, on AV in the United States, is the weakness in Europe. That if they're still struggling with the pandemic, if they are still struggling with their vaccine rollout, we live in a very interconnected and global world, and that could be a drag on our own growth over here in the States.
You know, Dan, part of what Peter just mentioned, if there's one silver lining out of this pandemic for this particular group, AV has, and video conferencing specifically, everyone has become more reliant on it through the pandemic, right? So the importance of it and people's desire and need to improve their video conferencing capabilities is key, right? As we move back to a sense of normalcy. So I think that's just really good news for our industry as a whole.
So we're getting close to the 1 hour mark, and I want to get to some of the questions we have queued up. But before I get to the questions, just one last query for all of you. Are there any resources on the web or otherwise that you would direct members of the commercial AV industry to get more information? You know, some URLs have been floating around in the chats and whatnot. But if someone's just saying, I need a little bit more even than I've gotten here, where would you recommend people go? Where should they turn to? And if you want to do it specifically, like if it's a higher education institution, they should go here. If I'm an integrator, I should go here. As much detail as you want to share about where they can go for more details.
I had posted a few things in the chat. You know, certainly a higher government site that I posted on there, just so that everybody's aware within the chat. They break down, you know, what grants are available and some of the rules and regulations in applying for those grants. To my mind, that's a key one. If you're interested in performance venues, the Save Our Stages, and again, the National Independent Venue Association.org, I believe it is. If you just Google National Independent Venue Association, they'll help direct you to some of the Save Our Stages benefits and how to apply and all of that stuff.
And I've said a couple of times, you know, the SBA site has a lot of FAQ type documents and checklists and videos. The Treasury Department has a website that tracks mostly what's still on the SBA website as well. From a practical perspective, I have found the AICPA's information just be helpful from a calculation and, you know, trying to get through the nuts and bolts of how some of these figures that you have to think about as you're looking at these different programs. I think that they put out some very helpful information as well. And for the PPP program, I definitely would reach out to your lender and look at your lender's web pages, because most lenders have put out their own sets of frequently asked questions, which can also go a long way to getting some quick answers if you can't, for instance, get someone on the telephone.
Yeah, and Avixa is putting a lot of effort to try and serve our members in our community throughout the pandemic. You know, from market research perspective, I invite everyone to you know, email me, phanson@avixa.org, or just our broad market research at avixa.org email for any questions. We have a lot of resources, including our monthly business index that I brought up free for everybody on the website, our December update to our market sizing, which is free for enterprise members, a wide range of market research to help folks, and as well as, you know, education and other resources throughout the broader avixa.org website. So, you know, I'm sure folks are probably mostly already familiar with us and our organization, but very much invite you to visit our website and you know, contact the market research team and myself directly. Really happy to share what we know, and try and help this community of ours.
So let's work our way through some of these questions. I've been scrolling through them, and they're very good. So let's start with, since PPP loan amount is determined by payroll, and SVOG is basically theatrical, movie, museum, venue operators, promoters that have ticket sales, where's the assistance for AV companies that are 99% on 1099 contract employees and are not venue operators, promoters, and do not have ticket sales? There are AV companies that provide all the audio, video, staging, lighting, rigging equipment for these venues. And companies like these have suffered as much as any other business. Any thoughts on that from anyone?
I want to make sure I'm interpreting this right. Is the issue that the AV company doesn't have employees on payroll, that the AV company itself relies on 1099s?
Yeah, it says that are 99% 1099 contract employees.
Yeah, it does seem, unfortunately, that there could be, a little bit of a gap between some of the programs and how you could apply. Now, I think, the company itself could probably apply for a PPP loan, but the size of that loan is going to be dependent, of course, on those payroll costs, and the independent contractor payments are going to be excluded from your loan calculation. Again, I think you may try to be a beneficiary indirectly through some of the Shattered Venue grant recipients if they're able to expend funds on the AV companies themselves. Peter, looks like you might have something to say as well.
Yeah, it is tough. Very difficult for independent contractors, and looking through some of our actually employment research data that we just got in, and excited to publish like late spring, and you can see some challenges that those independent gig workers have had. Now the good news is, and Meredith, maybe you can talk a little bit more about this, but typically independent contractors, gig workers would not be eligible at all for unemployment benefits, but they have been sort of invited into the program a little bit, at least under the CARES Act. Is that correct?
An independent contractor, him or herself, could apply for a PPP loan.
Right.
A business that, I'm using the term employs in air quotes, but a business that would engage an independent contractor could not apply on behalf of the independent contractor. Does that make sense?
Right.
The independent contractor has the opportunity to apply separately.
Yeah, so maybe if you're a business owner of that type of business, you're going to want to be, applying for your own salary and then trying to help your 1099s apply for their own salary from the PPP program.
So we have a question from Phil Sanchez, who's asking about the risk of inflation. The Larry Summerses and others of the world are concerned about overheating the economy and the risks of inflation. So Phil is asking about the conventional wisdom on the risk of inflation, given the fact that some of the stimulus will be spent on alleviating debt. Is there concern there?
Yeah, I really don't buy it. So the Federal Reserve, their projection by the end of the year, inflation is 2.4%, which is right in line with the 2% target that they aim for. And the two reasons that if you asked me to make a bet, even money, I'd take the under on the 2.4%. And there are two reasons for that, and two reasons that I'm not concerned about inflation. First, even though we're talking about this, like the kind of the bullish nature of the outlook, in light of this stimulus package getting output up over where it was in 2019, by the end of 2021. Right now, we're about 10 million jobs below where we would have been without the pandemic. 10 million. And like historic recoveries in terms of jobs, like getting a few 100,000 new jobs in a month would be excellent. Now, we could have 1 million jobs a month for every single month for the rest of the year, and we'd still be below where we would have been without the pandemic. So there is just an abundance. It's sad, it's unfortunate, but the truth is there's an abundance of slack in the labor market. And that's going to really create a lot of downward pressure on wages. Not to say that they're not going to increase at all, but or decrease. They're definitely not going to decrease. That'd be a very unusual result. But just that we're not going to see too big of a fight for workers driving increase of wages, creating that inflationary spiral, because there's just so much slack. The other reason beyond that labor market slack that is going to be very influential and going to really stop inflation is that right now the Federal Reserve is being about as expansionary in terms of money supply as possible. That means, you know, interest rates at zero, trying to buy assets to put or buy debt in order to throw more cash out into the market. They're trying to increase the money supply with every lever they can. But what that means is that, you know, at the first sign of like problematic inflation being really kind of above that 2% on average for a while, they have a huge capacity to control that inflation if it becomes necessary in 2022. I think that, you know, honestly, right now, it's just not something to be talking about and something to be worried about because there's just that huge slack. There's that and so much power the Federal Reserve has, even if it happens in a couple years' time, like to fight against it. So I think that's a concern that really should be put to bed, at least for the duration of 2021.
The next question, it was asked about 40 minutes ago, so it could well be that, you know, it was largely addressed already, but it's going back to PPP and forgiveness. Could the panel reiterate when PPP is currently set to expire? And if it is extended, if there's an extension date that they're working toward? You know, what would it be extended for? 2 months, 3 months, 4 months? And also just like a high level, if I'm looking to apply for PPP for my business, where do I go?
Sure. So currently it's scheduled to expire March 31st. I believe the proposed extension is through May 31st. If you're looking to apply, you know, and you have a lender already, that's a great place to start because I think that'll make life easier. But otherwise, if you go to the SBA website, they have a lender, like a list of lenders who are authorized to make PPP loans. And, you know, I think there are a lot of different options. Most lenders, you know, have this delegated authority to make the loans. So, you know, there's a lot of lenders out there, both traditional banks and, you know, fintech type organizations that are lending money. As for forgiveness, if you already have a PPP loan, the general rule of thumb is that if you apply for forgiveness within 10 months of the end of your covered period, which I don't want to get into because it's too detailed for this, but that you're good to go as far as your principal and interest payments are deferred during that 10-month period. If you go beyond that, you're going to have to start paying your principal and interest payments. The loans typically have a 2 to 5 year maturity date, depending on when you took your loan out. But that's the rule of thumb. So, you know, again, be in touch with your lender. They should be able to give you some precise calendar dates when you want to get that forgiveness application in.
So it looks like we have one question left. It's a long one, but I think it's important for me to give all the detail. My event videography, photography business was devastated in 2020. I had to get a full-time corporate job just to make ends meet. And 2021 doesn't look to be any better if summer festivals don't go off as normally planned. Large-scale weddings are still not happening this spring or summer either. To whom and how do I reach out for support for my small business? Is there anything earmarked to help small business folks like me? And again, this is an event videography photographer.
I would think that PPP is going to be your best bet there. So I would look at those resources on the SBA website.
Great. Unless anyone else has any closing thoughts, which by all means I'd be happy to share with our audience, I'd just like to thank everyone for joining the panel and a very informative hour. I really appreciate all of your time. Once again, we were joined by Peter Hansen, Economic Analyst of Avixa, Troy Jensen, Senior Manager, Enterprise Accounts with Shore, and Meredith Boylan, Partner with Venable LLP. My name is Dan Farisi. I'm Editor of Sound and Communications. For more great content like this, read Sound and Communications each month or go to www.soundandcommunications.com. And we look forward to seeing you on future webinars and other digital initiatives. Once again, thank you, Peter, Troy, and Meredith. Have a great day, and thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
Bye-bye.
Good being here with everybody.
Right.